Welcome. I was looking for an emoji of splitting wood, but I could not find one, so I just went with a celebration emoji. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about splitting user stories, theory and practice. And this is, I'm excited about this because this is an area that I think lots and lots of teams really struggle with. And it's also an area where a small amount of improvement can make a huge, huge difference. So hopefully this proves useful to everyone. Let's see here. Okay. So Slido coming up here. Here's the, let's see, is this the one that just tells you where to join? Let me paste it in here again. Our first question here is, why might you want to split a user story into two smaller pieces? Let me, okay, looks like everybody's getting into that, so that looks good. Okay, cool. So let's see, we've got, it can deliver value faster, smaller pieces of work are less overwhelming, so yeah, absolutely. Easier conversion to sprints, so probably that... Yeah. Okay, hang on, let me do something here just to make sure no one does anything they didn't intend to.
Thank you so much, I appreciate it.
Okay, there. We'll have to have any proprietary information accidentally leaked. Okay, allow QA to test incrementally. So if we have smaller stories, we can deliver something useful, get feedback from QA more quickly. Testable units of work, that's good. Too big, split things because they're too big. Easier to estimate. Work is too large for one sprint. So yes, these are all great reasons for why we might want to split stuff. So we're going to be looking at these things. So let's see. Next question. In your team, who is most in favor of splitting user stories on your teams? Is it the developers, the business, the scrum masters, quality assurance, or management? And this is just for my curiosity because my experience has kind of been one way. So I think this is interesting that we're about half and half with developers and scrum masters. A lot of times I've seen on teams that the developers are somewhat resistant to splitting the stories. And particularly if you get architecture in there as well. Now this may just be a side effect of the teams I've happened to work with. But I found a lot of times, until the developers have done it. So maybe this is just an indication that you're working with a lot of very mature teams. But teams that haven't experienced splitting stories before, a lot of times I find the developers and the architects are very opposed to splitting it. Some of it's just because they haven't done it before, but because their idea is if we do smaller units, we'll have to do rework in order to get to where we know we need to be later. So sometimes that creates some resistance. Looks like most of the scrum masters are in favor of it. Quality assurance, not so much. Management, 3, and some of these management may not care as long as we're delivering stuff. And business, 0%, which may not mean that they're opposed. It may just mean that they don't care how the sausage is made. Okay, so why split user stories? Well, one common reason is so we can fit it into a sprint. But I would like to suggest that may not be the best reason is to fit it in the sprint. And if we think of terms of splitting it just so it will fit in the sprint, we will probably lose a lot of the value that we can get from splitting stories. So if you're working with a team, I would try to steer away from saying we're trying to split stuff so it fits in a sprint, even if it does help you do that. Because if that's the driving goal, you may split stories in ways that don't actually take advantage of the things of what you can actually get out of splitting stories. So the big reason I would suggest that we want to split stories is so we can deliver something before we deliver everything. So if we've got a story, if there's a way to deliver something or some part of that before we deliver the whole story, that's a benefit. That's getting things into the user's hands faster. That's a good use of Agile. So Agile Principle says our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. If there is a way to split a story so we can deliver something value sooner than the way the story was formed originally, that's something Agile says we should be striving to try to do. Also says working software is the primary measure of progress. If there is a way for us to take a story and split it down in a way that we can produce something that's working, that has meaning to the user, that they can either start using in production or at least start giving us feedback on, that means we've made progress. Whereas if we wait and tell the whole story, we're deferring the point at which we make progress, which means we're deferring when we start getting feedback, and we're deferring when we will start getting value from it. So the reason I call these things out is because we want to be thinking about the value that we're getting from splitting the story, not just can we fit it in this kind of arbitrary time box we've got. Another Agile principle: deliver working software frequently, from a couple of weeks to a couple of months, with a preference to the shorter time scale. If we're able to split stories, we're able to deliver more independent units more frequently in a shorter time span. Welcome changing requirements, even late in development. Agile processes harness change for a customer's competitive advantage. If we're able to split a story down, we're able to take advantage of change a lot more rapidly. So if you think of it this way, if I've got a story that's going to take me 8 weeks to deliver, and so everybody just goes heads down 8 weeks and then delivers it, and then the customer comes back and says, oh yes, all the requirements we gave you, it turns out Google has entered the marketplace now, so we're going to have to do something entirely different. That feedback is a lot slower, and we're not able to adapt to change as quickly if we're delivering something over 8 weeks than if we're able to deliver small things every 2 to 4 days. If we're able to deliver something every 2 to 4 days, we can get that feedback a lot more quickly, and the customers can have more input on what comes next in order to adapt to a rapidly changing marketplace. Okay, so let's visualize this. And I will tell you this, what we're going to go through right here was very eye-opening to me when I really sat down and wrote this out. So let's assume that we've got the value is the up and down axis, and the time and effort is the right and left. So in this, we've got a big story, and it will deliver a lot of value. You know, that much value is going to be delivered by this story. But it is also going to take a lot of time. So we've got both of those things here. Now, if we want to figure out how to split this, so just imagine for a second, look at this and try to figure out how you would split this. So just on your screen, just imagine a line or draw a line, how you might try to split this. Got it? Got what you think it might be a reasonable way to split it? So the first way, when I was sitting down and drawing this stuff out, is like, okay, we'll split it like this. You know, draw a line down the middle. Well, if we want to deliver in half the time, if we want to deliver half the value in half the time, so a whole amount of the story is still going to be the same amount of value, maybe the same amount of time, but how would we split it? Well, if we split it like this, we're now taking half the time and delivering the full amount of value. Well, that doesn't quite sound right, right? If there was a way to split it like this is absolutely how we should do it. And then let's split it again and split it again, split it again, and we'll deliver the full amount of value in like a infinitesimal small amount of time. Okay, so that probably doesn't work. So maybe our line's going the wrong way. So let's draw the line this way now. We split it that way. Okay, that probably doesn't make sense, because now we're delivering half the value in the full amount of time. And that doesn't make sense either, right? That's probably not, this is not what we want to do. So the thing here is if we want to actually split this and deliver half of this story, it's going to look something like this. So we're going to deliver half the value in half the time. So our graph of how this thing maps to value and time looks something like this. We're going to deliver half the value in half the time. So we've got 4 squares now, and we're crossing out 3 of them that we're not going to do. So it'll look something like this. So now we're delivering half the value of this story in half the amount of time. So then we can add in the other half. So let's say after we deliver that first story, we split it, we deliver that first story, and then we go on and deliver the other. Now the total amount of elapsed time here is the exact same, and the total amount of elapsed or of gained value is exactly the same. But what is this stuff right here? You know, we're delivering the same value over the same amount of time, but by splitting it and delivering it incrementally, we've got these black holes. Like, what are these things where the question marks are? So think about that for just a second. Or actually, I've got a slide for this, don't I? Okay, so what's all this other area where the question marks are? Is it management overhead? Is it waste from inefficiencies? Is it waiting for work, cost of delay, slack, or buffer? How would you describe, if you were showing this to someone to explain why you're looking at splitting stories, how would you describe, and you got this far in drawing the graphs, how would you describe that work in those other places? All the above? Okay, and I'm not saying there's a right or wrong answer here. Just think about it and go and select it. Is it not going to show me the answers till, maybe I've got to move forward to see the answers. Okay, there we go. Now we're seeing stuff. Okay, waste from inefficiencies, and that may be true. Waiting for work, I think there's reason that we could think of that. Buffer, which maybe just be waiting for stuff. Slack, cost of delay. Okay, so the goal here isn't to get a right answer. I just want to know what you think of these areas, and we'll talk about it a little bit more. So these different areas here. So what happened to all this stuff here? Well, I would suggest that in most situations, that first area in the time dimension is where we're waiting for capacity, because we put all of our effort onto that first block. So the reason we are waiting to deliver that second block that's up there, the reason we're waiting to do that is because we don't have capacity. All of our capacity is dedicated to delivering that first unit of value. So there's a delay because we're waiting for capacity to work on the next thing. And when I say waiting for capacity, that's not bad. I don't mean that as a bad thing, and it's not necessarily that we could just throw more developers at it and deliver it quicker, depending on how we approached it. We're just putting all of our effort into delivering that first bit, which means we're choosing to wait and delay to work on the second bit, because we want to have the first piece sooner. So this down here, though, this delay is actually waiting for deployment. So if we were to wait to deploy that first thing until we finish the entire entire story, the entire big story, that is waiting for, we've got some work done, but we haven't actually deployed it to anyone yet. So in both of these places, we're actually waiting for something. So half the story is spent waiting in one way or another if we do it as a monolithic large story. However, if we do it like this, we're able to get value sooner because we can deliver that first smaller story, get feedback on it, start getting it through testing or whatever, and then work on delivering the next part of it. But what if those stories can be split? So if we take those stories and split those into smaller units, we may be able to get something like this. Well, now we're at the point that 75% of the story, in the old way of doing it, if we were delivering the entire story before, 75% of the story was spent waiting in one capacity or another. When we deliver them smaller like this, we're able to basically make that waiting in some ways go away to where we're no longer waiting on that first story. We're going to deliver it right away, and then we get return on investment after that. Now, when I actually sat down and graphed this out, this was my reaction. I got this reaction from looking at it. It's like, wow, look how much, and it made perfect sense why some of the teams that I had been working with, we were able to take a team. Oh, I'm sorry, I was going somewhere else. But it made sense why some of the teams I worked with that were delivering really small chunks really frequently it wasn't just that customers got stuff in their hands sooner. It was dramatically different how much stuff they could get done with very, very few people compared to the teams that were dealing with really, really big stories, and it took a really long time to get everything actually out to the user, and just their productivity is really, really bad. It just took forever to get anything done. So what if splitting the stories? So the other thing that happens with this is this represents where we're actually doing the same amount of the same, delivering everything. We're just doing it more incrementally and getting feedback faster. But what if splitting the story lets us find parts that we can skip? So for example, what if we get into here and we're like, you know what, that last story, now that we've gotten feedback, we ordered these things in a way that made us realize that last piece we don't really need, or we don't really need it now. We can go on to work on something else. And we think of that, simplicity is the art of maximizing the amount of work not done, that's essential, that's an agile principle. To follow that principle, we need to work as close to this way as possible, because this lets us maximize the amount of work not done. If we see this as a big monolithic thing that we're delivering the big story, we're not giving ourselves the option to decide not to do something. It all gets crammed in there. So so how often have you found a way to lower scope by splitting a story? I'm just kind of, on a scale of 1 to 5, I think there may be some. Okay, so 1 is never, 5 is many times each month, where by splitting stories down, you found a way to leave something out that would have gotten put in if you had been dealing with the story as a whole, a really big monolithic story. Okay, so it sounds like we're getting some of this. And I would, if you don't feel like this is happening very often, I would ask yourself, is it possible, and it may or may not be the case, but I would ask yourself, is it possible that we are dealing with stories that are bigger than they need to be? Because on teams that I've been with that were really doing really small, like in delivering stuff like sometimes within the day or 2 to 4 days, or just really, really small and really interacting rapidly with the customer, this type of thing was happening on a regular basis, like sometimes multiple times a week. So, and your situation may be different, but I would just think about this. If you feel like this doesn't happen very often, it may be that your stories are bigger than they absolutely need to be, or it may just be a product of how you're working. But I would, if I found myself in that situation, I would challenge myself to say, is there a way to deliver these stories smaller so we can get feedback sooner, so the customer can decide what comes next at a more granular level. So hopefully as we work through things, more things that are less important get left to the end, and some of those may be able to be skipped or done in a simpler way or deferred. So in this type of, when we see this graph like this makes perfect sense how you can see a team that has 5 devs on it out deliver a team that's got 50. And I'm not just making up numbers there. I've actually worked on teams where there was a quote from this organization. They had put together an estimate that was going to take 5 years to deliver with about 50 developers, roughly. And we took from those same developers that worked at this organization, we pulled in 5 that were really, really good. And we were able to deliver that entire product in 4 years with 5 developers versus the 50. And a big piece of that, there were lots of reasons, but a big piece of that was because we were splitting stories down in this way that allowed us to get feedback more rapidly and allowed us to split things off. And sometimes we found that those things didn't need to be done or could be deferred until later. And we were able to get testing a lot more automated because we were splitting these stories up like this. Okay, so why split stories? To fit in a sprint. Hopefully this gave you some reasons of why you would want to split stories that aren't just to fit into a sprint. We're not doing this just because it splits into a sprint. It's because we want to deliver something before we deliver everything. So what ends up happening though is if we don't split stories is it's very easy for all that space there that I said was waiting for capacity to work on the story can often fill with unnecessary work, because if the stories aren't split down to the smallest thing, it's very easy to do lots of other things in here that aren't necessarily driven by here's how we can deliver the best for the customer. Now, sometimes those things are stuff that are good and things that we want to do or we may be able to justify. But without having that, here's a story we're planning to get to the customer in the next few days, it's very easy for scope to creep and get bigger. And then this other area here is where we're waiting to provide value. We've done work, if we're dealing with a monolithic story, if we're not actually getting that into people's hands, we're just waiting to actually realize the value of the stuff that we've already worked on. Now, often if we're working on the big story, we don't work in a way where we can deliver anything, right? We haven't even thought of trying to split it up. So those are some of the capabilities or potential, how's a good way to say this? Those are some, by splitting it up, we give ourselves some possible futures that we could not have if we dealt with it as monolith. We can also reorder when things are delivered. If we deliver that first thing and say, hey, you know what? Really, I probably should have done it on the second one. The next thing we want to work at, we want to switch it around, because as we delivered this first one, we discovered something about this that makes it not the most important. Or we get ready to work on this, and you know what? We were going to work on that very first one first, but we realized that now, as we look at it, it would be easier to test and easier to demonstrate if we build this other one first. And we'll look at some examples of that here in a minute. And once we deliver these, we start getting a return on investment. So we deliver that first very small story, customer starts getting value. Deliver the next one, customer starts getting value. And the value can be a number, excuse me, a number of different things. It could be that it's in production and it's earning you money. But there's significant value in the customer, whoever's going to use this software, even just getting to use it at some point and say, hey, yes, this is exactly what I wanted from you. Now let me give you some feedback that will help you with the next piece of things. Or even if they come back and say, oh, you built exactly what I wanted, exactly what I asked for, and it's not anything like I wanted, it's much better to find that out when we deliver that small square than after we've delivered the entire thing. Okay, so when was the last time you heard someone on your team say, we better do this now because we will need it later to justify expanding scope? When was the last time you heard that?
I added that to the list.
Oh. Okay, my phone just added what I said to a list of some type. I wonder what that's about. Okay, well, I'll probably show up at some inopportune time at some point in the future. Okay, this week. So this is, and as a software engineer, I am very sympathetic to this saying, right? I know where they're coming from, and I have had that feeling before. It's like, oh, I'm getting ready to do right this. I should do these other things to get on place so it will benefit me later. And as a software engineer, I can reason through why that is better because I can do this now and then we'll be all set up to go faster in the future. That rarely actually works out. And it's kind of like the difference between a capitalistic society and a society that has central planning of everything that's produced. On paper, you can actually make a case for, and intellectually, you can make a case for that if we plan everything out, like this district over here makes the TVs for everyone. This district over here makes the shoes for everyone. And it will be very orderly and there'll be no waste because we won't be making anything that gets thrown away and stuff. And it looks so good. But it doesn't work out that way because human nature and because we've got chaos in the system, regardless of how well we try to plan. And so as a software engineer, I'm very sympathetic to this, but as somebody who's actually lived the chaos of delivering large systems, I also know that's not how things are going to play out. And we're much better off focusing on getting small units of things all the way through to the customer. And if there's things we think we need to do because they're important, make them part of every story. If security is important, don't stop working on everything to do security. Let's make sure that each story is delivered with all the security that's necessary for it to deploy to production. Okay, teams overestimate the value of avoiding future changes. So we want to do this now so we don't have to make changes later. And yes, intellectually, I understand why that's the case, but it also means if people are thinking like that, they're probably dramatically underestimating the value of getting something into the hands of the customer. And if you're in a situation where people are overvaluing not having to change and mold the system, grow and evolve the system, and they're underestimating the value of getting something in the customer's hands, you're setting yourself up for project failure. And by underestimating, I mean very dramatically underestimating the value of getting feedback from the user sooner. I have seen projects spend millions and millions of dollars underestimating this and only to get things canceled because they weren't getting things into the customer's hand and getting feedback sooner. Let's see. That's about the same question, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. Okay, so how to split stories. So now we're going to, oh good, we're doing good on time. So what we're going to do is that was kind of the theory of here's why you would want to do it, and hopefully gave you some ways that you can sell the idea of splitting stories to your team. Now we're going to shift over to kind of, well, what does this actually look like? We'll move from theory to practice. What does it look like to split stories? First, a few announcements now that we've got everybody here to get attention. Here's what's coming up in the next few weeks. On the 25th, Mike Clement is going to come and talk about focus on flow. This is going to be good. And when we sent out the things asking people what they'd like to hear more about, focusing on flow was something that people really wanted to hear. So we're delivering. Mike's going to come talk about that. And then on the 8th of next month, Ryan Latta is going to come and talk to us about how to introduce test-driven development, even if you don't code. So I'm looking forward to this to see how he's suggesting to try to help teams embrace test-driven development, even if you're not coming in as a software developer. So this should be relevant to people, even if you are a coder, that's great. But if you're not, this should be very, very relevant to you still. And then on, let's see, the 15th of next month, we're going to be talking about successful failure. So looking at how to arrange our work in a way that failures are not catastrophic and we can fail forward and we can learn for them. And I think I'm still working on getting this talk written. Hopefully we'll have some really interesting examples of failures that were successful as well as some that weren't, because those are fun to look at. And then on the 6th, let's see, April, this would be May, David Kopek, he's a professor of computer science at a university, and he's going to be talking about navigating open source licenses. So I think this probably has a lot of relevance to most of us are probably using open source license somewhere. So even if you're not on the dev side and choosing tools, this should be pretty interesting. Just make sure you understand the implications of stuff, because I know a lot of the places I've worked, this isn't necessarily well understood, and sometimes it can come back to bite you. So this will be a great kind of overview to let you know what types of things to look about and just being aware of what open source licensing looks like. These are all at events.agilelnl.com. If you see one that you want and you haven't got the invite, you can go get the invite sent to you. I encourage you to pass these on to your team if any of them look interesting. And then one other announcement here is, what did I do there? Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Okay. We have I've got a class coming up that will be we're starting in April. We've got we're probably going to cap it at 20 to 30 people. Can't, because I want to keep it small for lots of conversation. But we're going to go through these 5 business books, go through one a week, look at a summary of it, and then what we're all going to bring to is what's our biggest need right now, that something we want to improve with our team and the way we're working. And then we're going to we'll go through the summary and then really talk about the Agile principles that we saw in this, even though these books aren't necessarily about Agile, but how can we take what we learned about them back to our team to make things better? I did this about a year ago. It was very eye-opening. I learned a tremendous amount from the team, the 7 people that were in that. We've got 10 people signed up already on this one, and we've got another month to go. So I'm looking forward to this. And the people we've got, I'm very excited about, because they are the thing that makes this class is the interaction with the other students. And I'm very excited because we've got some really, really good people coming to this that I think are going to have lots of very interesting insights. So anyway, that's coming up. I threw the link to it there. If you are interested, there is a early bird still out. You may have gotten the email from it, or just reach out to me. I can give you that if it's in. I think the early bird lasts till Friday if for some reason you didn't get it. So very excited about this. We're looking for like another 10 people to sign up for it, up to another 10 people. Even with just 10 we got, it's going to be a great class. So if you want to go a little bit deeper on some things and really interact with your peers around how to take knowledge from the books and apply them to your team and to moving your team forward, this is going to be really good. The other thing about this that has proven very, very useful is a lot of us would love to read all these books, but we may not necessarily have time. This is a good way to get familiar with the concepts and big takeaways from it. And I found it to be very useful when interacting with the business side of things. Because a lot of times these are books that a lot of them have read at one point or another. And so it gives you kind of a shared vocabulary to try to introduce what you're trying to do within a context that they're more familiar with. So it can give you a lot of sometimes like political capital because you're able to speak the same language. So anyway, if that sounds interesting, we've got some spots left. I'd love to have you as part of that. Click on the link or reach out to me and we'll get you set up. Okay. Which invite do you plan to send? Okay, I guess this already came up. Which invite do you plan to send forward to a friend? We got 2 people have done that. So of the ones that we just talked about, which one, and you can select multiple ones, which are the ones that you're like, hey, I've got somebody on my team that would be very interested in this. And I just kind of wanted to do this to see what people were finding interesting. And please do participate in the Slido as we go, because it gives me a lot of feedback on things. Oh, it's kind of funny. Somebody just signed up for that and tried to go to it right now to see if the link worked. That will be next week. So, okay, looks like the focus on flow and successful failure are the big ones people want. Okay, and as always, the invites you have can be forwarded on to anyone else. I encourage you to send those to your team. Sometimes the Agile Lunch and Learns, I hope, are very useful to people, but if you've got several people that have gone to it, even if their takeaway is we don't agree with Mark, if you're able to have conversations about it with your team, that makes them very, very valuable in getting your team aligned and moving forward. Hopefully it is stuff that you agree with. But okay, so moving forward on how to split stories. Okay, so we talked about theory, we did some announcements, now we're going to talk about how to actually do splitting stories. The question I like to ask is, what is the smallest thing that the customer would perceive as being valuable? And if you ask yourself this, it gives you a way of splitting stories that's very, very different than just how can I fit stuff into a sprint. If I ask myself, what is the smallest thing that the customer would perceive as valuable, I end up splitting up stories in a way that let the product evolve while getting rapid feedback from the customers and the users that I would never come up with if I'm just thinking about how do I do something smaller or faster. So here's some work that you might see, and this is a common way that people want to split things up, is saying, this is a common way, particularly for developers, to try to split things up, is saying, let's set up a database, we're going to code the back end, and then we're going to create another story to create a framework, because developers love creating frameworks. I'm not immune to that either. And then displaying the app's title. So these are different ways we could split stuff. And I want you to look at these and think of which of these are actually going to be something that the user would perceive as progress. Setting up a database does not mean anything to the user. Coding the back end, if it's just the back end and the user can't see it, that doesn't help. Creating a framework, that doesn't do anything for the user that they can actually see. However, displaying the app's title on a web page they can go to does show progress. And you may also discover that no one agrees on what the app's title should be. But what I want you to think about is these things, the top ones here, the top three here, are ones that we're very likely to hear teams want to split things up into. The bottom one is the one that we can actually use as showing progress. And if you think of it kind of like a cake, one of these ways is slicing it like this, an entire cake. Maybe pie might be better, but imagine that you get a pie and you want to experience the pie. You're the user and you want to experience a pie. If they just give you the crust and say, okay, eat that first, that's not going to be very satisfying if we get a layer across like that. What we really want something is all the way through. Okay, so yes, I like the key lime pie. You wouldn't want to eat your key lime pie layer by layer. If you're wanting to show your customer that you're making progress, don't give them just an empty pie crust. Give them a slice all the way through that they can actually experience. So you want to avoid this. So let's look at some examples of splitting stories. So this was a customer portal for printing. Let's see. Okay, so it's a customer portal for printing. So a big company that sells lots of printed supplies. And we were making a portal for them so their customers could come in, see a list of items that they were interested in, and order those items. Lots of times these were highly customized, like think of ID cards for rooms at hotels that has the hotel's logo and stuff on them, or for a particular event, those types of things. So highly customized. And most of the time, they'd go and submit it, and then they just get the order. But every once in a while, customers would need to modify the order. They'd send something in and go, oh, I just looked at it, that's not right, or saw the proof, I need to make a change to it. So we were asked to, this is something project my company did the coding on, and they said the customers need to be able to change orders, the admins needed to be able to get the change notifications so they know something had changed, and then the admin needed to be able to approve the changes. And this was all one big thing under the customers being able to change the orders. So how do you think the customer prioritized these options? So in the customer's mind, what was most important to them, or I guess you're ranking these. Customer can change the orders, change notification, or admin approval. How would they rank those in terms of priority? And the customer in this case is the person actually placing the order. So it looks like most of us are saying that the customers can change the order, which absolutely, right? That's the thing that the customer wants. They really don't care what goes on in the back end as far as notifications and admin approval. They just want to be able to change the order. That's the most important thing to the customer. And the customer that's using the portal. Now, the people that we were working with were the admins, but the only reason they were doing this was to try to make their customer happy. So that's what we were focused on. So that's what we were trying to look at delivering first. So the monolithic story here needs to change orders and all the workflow around that. So if we color code these, the red's going to be something that has really high value, the yellow is medium value, and the green is low value. I don't know if those are the best colors for it or not. But anyway, the whole story had medium value. But we split it up and we said, okay, the lowest value thing here is notifying the admin of change, letting them know that it had changed, like sending an email or something. The medium value for this in this particular situation was the approval workflow. Did they have a way to actually approve it? And then the really high value here is let the user change the order. So we were able to deliver these things first by letting the user change the order and then backing in the approval workflow. And I don't know if we ever got around to notifying the admin of the change, because I think when we did the workflow, they said that's sufficient and we worked on something else. It's been a few years, I don't remember. But we delivered it in this order because we were able to split it. If we hadn't have split it, we wouldn't have been able to break those things out like that. Now, notice we did not do it like this. The tendency of developers might be to say, okay, we're going to research database upgrade, which has very low value to the customer, research workflow tools, which maybe would have medium value, and then the high value, which is actually change the order and associated workflows. Now, as part of each story that we delivered that we had split, if we needed to figure out how to update the database, that was just part of the story. But the story was all driven around what is meaningful to the customer that we're trying to satisfy and make happy here. Does that kind of make sense? The difference between this, which we want to avoid, and this, which works really, really well? If it does, thumbs up, thumbs down. What do you guys think? Make sense? Okay. So remember, once we were able to get it to where the users were able to change the orders, they were able to start getting value from that, even though not everything they wanted was done. So here's another example: internet announcements. This was when COVID was looking like it might become an issue. It's a large organization, and they had on their internet site, where you could go to find out what was at the cafeteria for the day. On their internet site, they wanted to have a banner that would pop up that would say, "Hey, here's the if there was important notifications, like make sure you get this or that, or looks like we're going to be sending anybody home." There were lots of things they wanted to make sure there was a better way to communicate than what they had at that point. Now, here were some of the things they wanted to do under this big monolithic story, which was post a number of announcements with dates. So like all announcements would go up and when they rolled on and when they rolled off. They wanted different announcements priorities. So like if you came, if Bob comes and visits the site and he hasn't seen the top priority one, show him that. But if he has, then move on to the second priority one. And then also rotate through the different announcements to make sure everybody gets to see things. And the requirements were very, very well done. They had great ideas of what they wanted to do with this, but it was also pretty complex. So we took that story, there's the big story, medium value story overall, and we split it up. And we said, you know what, how important is it to schedule the announcement? And the actual conversation we had here with them is I said, you know what, there's lots of things here, your requirements look great. And I was sitting with the developers and I said, how valuable it would be if you could just show a single announcement, because you can't do that today. If there was just a box and when you type something in the box, it shows up as a banner at the top that you can close that says, here's whatever that information is. We're sending everybody home and, whatever. How valuable would that be if we could just deliver that quickly? Because the developers had said this whole thing was going to take 6 to 8 weeks. And the business said, oh, well, that would be awesome because I could use this today. If you can give me that, I have something I would put on it today if we can do this. And the developer said, well, that's easy. That won't take 6 to 8 weeks. We think we can have that for you by tomorrow afternoon. And they did. So the next day we came in and met with him to show him what we had done. And I think he had already found it and was using it. And his whole department was very, very excited because they'd never gotten anything that fast. And they were able to come up with an idea of what they needed. And then by splitting it up and finding the thing that was the most valuable to them, they were able to get value really, really quickly. And so then I said, okay, so what's the next most thing? Is it rotating the announcements? Is that the next most valuable things? And what he said, and this was a beautiful example of splitting stories at work. He said, oh, no, we don't want to do any of those other things now. He said, this worked so well, and this, by splitting it up like this, you gave us 90% of what was valuable, or 95% of what was valuable in this story. The other stuff at this point in time is low enough value that we would rather you do the same magic on this other story we have over here. So he had something else that he wanted to see, can we do something similar to where we can find the thing that's really, really valuable and get it done in a day or two, instead of going on with everything that they had planned here. And to me, that's a beautiful example of what can happen if you're really focused on delivering small things that the customer is saying is the most valuable thing. Oftentimes, a lot of what they've asked for just falls off because they'd rather have you do that really high value magic again on the next story. And it puts the customer in the driver's seat like is very difficult to do in any other way. Okay, so with that example, did we just find a pattern? So when we need to do one or more things, start by building one thing and delivering it. So for example, customer needs to be able to order shoes. You've probably seen this example before. So we're building an e-commerce site for, I think, Joe's shoe sale shop or something like that. So customer needs to be able to order shoes, but can we make it so they can order one pair at a time, right? We obviously want a shopping cart and all those things, but what if we do something like this? Or you've got Sam's shoes, and you've got all the shoes listed out. You click to order it. It takes you to a page where you put the size, your name, your address, and a credit card, and it places the order. Okay, that's probably the simplest way we can come up with to actually order shoes online. The simpler thing might be just put the entire inventory online. But to get this up and running, we're going to have to set up the web application, inventory, get the inventory synced somehow. We're going to have to do credit card processing, ship. There's a whole lot of things to do that fairly simple 2-page application. But if we can deliver that, we can then get feedback from them and then continue to evolve it. So this is an example of splitting the story. Now, if we go back to that, this is going to change significantly, right, as the application continues to grow. We probably don't want to have the credit card place order on the page that we really want them to put it in the cart in the long term. But by doing it this way, we're able to evolve the application by splitting these stories down into smaller things the customer says is valuable. Another example. So this is a common pattern. So allocate funds by percentage. So let's say you're working on, in this case, we've got ye old 401k. And we're going to put the percentage we want in the stocks. Now, to make this work, we're going to have to make sure that the percentage always sums to 100. So there's lots of stuff we need to do to make sure that happens. That we may need to make sure that they're not putting the same stock twice. Maybe that wouldn't matter, but that might be something we have to consider. So there's a lot of complexity that goes into a form like this. So if we're looking for what's the simplest way we can deliver the next step forward, the simplest thing we can do that the user can actually start giving us feedback on, it might look something like this. We're just going to allocate the entire thing. So yes, we know we want to have percentage allocation, but if we start off with this, the customer is able to actually give us feedback. The user can say, hey, this works really well. Or they may say, you know what, that's not how we think about stocks. We need to choose it from a list instead of typing it, or whatever that looks like. And then once we get this working and can get feedback from the users, we can then come back and we've got options for what to choose next. We can do the percent allocation like we looked at earlier, or maybe we say, let's go ahead and take this to the next piece, which is actually interfacing with the order system that handles the stock purchase processing. Or maybe there's something here, some security that needs to be part of this, that we have to go through to verify the person is who they say they are, or whatever that is. Maybe that's the next thing we want to build, or maybe our application doesn't even have a login yet. Oh yes, that's a good example. A 401k is a personal retirement investment account that's used for lots of organizations. You're right. That wouldn't have made any sense if you didn't know. So yes, the 401k, and I guess maybe this is the Pirates version of their retirement account or something. Or we may discover as we're doing this that performance is an issue. So maybe we need to build out some parallel processing. So, there may be lots of things we can do, but we're getting feedback sooner instead of waiting until the end. Maybe this is a big enough deal we want to start on this particular thing next. So when we need to do one or more things, we can usually start by building one of those things. So what other patterns might potentially exist? Well, can you do a story with simplified data? So let me give you an example of that. So in this case, and this is very similar to things I've done with large software projects where they need to create a user for some reason in the system. And so we've got name, address, account history, and maybe 100 other things that we need to get about the particular user in this. But if we ask ourselves, what is the smallest set of data needed to create a user? Maybe it really comes down to we could create the user with a name. And that would be sufficient to start doing things with. And if we do that, we can then start moving things through the system and then come back and flesh it out as we need more information. Like we may hit a point later on that the user needs to do something with their account history. Well, that might be the great time to go ahead and build this thing out once we get to the point that's driving the creation of that account history, because the user is trying to do this next thing with it. Now, we may not be able to deploy this live without all these things being here, but that feedback is very, very valuable. So another common pattern, can you defer validation? So in this case, maybe there's requirements around what's an invalid name, an invalid address, and must contain only alphanumeric under the account history because it links to it or something like that. This isn't to say we don't need validation, but we may be able to get feedback and get more of the system working and more of the flow working, so we start getting more feedback on the overall system if we defer this stuff till later. So we may be able to defer the validation. Particularly if the customer can provide feedback without validation. If the customer can say, okay, yes, now I've gone through the process of creating user, and this lets me build this other part that maybe is really, really high risk. Perhaps the validation is low risk because we know how to do that. We've done that 1,000 times. But once we create the user, there's this other thing that we're not even sure if it's computationally going to be possible, or it's going to interface with some AI engine that we're not sure is going to give us the results we need. And if we're able to get to that point first or earlier and get the risk forward, that's a very good use of splitting up our stories. Another reason for splitting up like this is, what if the customer decides they don't need to create users? Now that probably sounds crazy, like why would you do that? But I've been in situations where we were splitting stories up, very similar to what we just did, and then all of a sudden the business decided, you know what, we just realized we can pull all of our users from another existing system. So we don't actually have to have a form to create the users. And by splitting it up like that, we were able to get that feedback sooner without having built lots and lots of pieces and all the details of this piece that was just going to go away once we got into things. So this is a good example of how splitting it up helps us helps us take advantage of potential futures that we probably can't even predict today. Can you simplify the workflow? So if you've got something really, really complex, is there a way to make it simple? Well, here's an example of that. So let's say our workflow is we get the user's info, and then there's account info, and then there's optional info 1, optional info 2, and then we show them a summary, and then a confirmation, and then it finally saves that, and then they show up in the list of accounts. Well, maybe we could just kind of skip the workflow to where it just goes from user's account to the confirmation and then shows the list of accounts. Not that we're not going to build the rest of this, but we can actually get the system, we can start getting feedback on something a lot sooner by getting it to work here and then add in all the other things as the user is saying is the next and most important thing to work on. Okay, so in this case right here, what if we were to defer the confirmation? And this pattern should be pretty common. Like we get all the way to confirmation and then you hit say, yes, this looks good, and then you save it. But you may be able to defer the confirmation. Maybe something as simple as going from this to saying, okay, we're going to create the user an account, we click save, and then they show up on the list of accounts. That's a very, very simple flow. Now, the other beautiful thing about this is we can take this and set up the testing for it. And then as we expand, if we're using good testing frameworks and good testing products, as it expands and puts all those other things in, a lot of that testing stuff can be reused to validate that all that other stuff that we add in between it works as expected. Can you defer one of the inputs or interfaces? So for example, so this is an example I mentioned in some other talks before, but we had a requirement to have a UI for putting in holidays, for government holidays. And the old system that we were replacing had this, so they definitely wanted it. So we had worked out we were going to build this holiday UI because it was important. And but then the business, after they got used to, and that was determined early on in the project, but as they got used to figuring out ways to defer things and recognize that if they're able to defer stuff or split stories and defer pieces of it, they were able to do other things that were much more valuable to them. And the business finally came back and said, you know what? We really do need to have a holiday schedule, but can we split the concept of the holiday schedule from the idea of the UI? Let's split those up separately and just have a holiday schedule that we can load with the CSV file. In this particular case, the business users had direct access to the database and could do stuff like that. So they said, we want the holiday capability, but we'd rather defer the UI because once we load in the CSV file, we're good for a year. And in the next year, there's a whole lot of other things that are more important to us. So that would be an example of deferring one of the inputs or the interfaces. Can you process just part of an input? So here's another pattern for splitting stories. So a file with lots of data. So here's lots of data. I've got header, lots and lots of records. And evidently here we've got duplicate records. There's hundreds of records in it. Well, what's the first thing we can do to process this file to start showing that we're making progress and stuff? Well, maybe we forget all the records in the summary and just say, can we start with the header? Can we come up with a way to show that we can successfully validate the header and reject things that have incorrect headers? That's very, very small, but it helps give us proof that we're doing things. It helps give us feedback from the users. The users then have to figure out what does a valid header mean? And it may be easier to figure that within the context of just the header than everything they could possibly ask for in the file. Next, maybe we add the summary total validation. So we go through and we don't worry what's in the record. We just make sure that the totals work. And that's a way of splitting up the stories to where we're incrementally handling the validation of these files in ways that will let us do things a lot more rapidly, get feedback a lot more rapidly than if we see everything just as being a huge monolithic story. Okay. Did I go to the right slide here? Okay, I think you guys are all on that. Here is a diagram, and if you go to this QR code up here, or just search for Agile for All, how to split a story. I think the URL is down there at the bottom. This is a very, very good thing of just different patterns you can apply. So it's just a flow chart of it. So if you're interested in this and kind of want to take something back to your team, I didn't make this, but it's agileforall.com. That QR code up there, if you snapshot that, that'll give you a way to get to it. So I'll leave this up for just a second. And then we're going to do our quiz and give away a sweatshirt here. So this can be a useful thing. So I'll leave 4 more seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. And if for some reason you didn't get that and you want it, email me. I'll get it sent to you. Okay, so now let's do a quiz over what we talked about today. We will give away a sweatshirt. It's starting to get warm here, so this may be the last week we do the sweatshirts. So my We value face-to-face communication. Turn your video on. This is actually the sweatshirt that I use. So it probably looks a little bit dirty. Anyway, we've got hooded sweatshirts, and I think I've got every size except for medium. I think I've got small, large, extra large, double extra large, maybe even triple extra large. So anyway, that's what you're competing for here. And they are nice sweatshirt. My daughter just stole one to send to one of her teachers, an online teacher. So they're in high demand. Okay, so I'll give you just a few more seconds for everybody to join. And 3 more seconds. 2, 1. And okay, which is the best reason for trying to split stories? To fit a story in a sprint, to deliver something before delivering everything, to humor Mark, which has been the reason some of the teams I coach, to make it look like we're doing more work. What's the best reason for splitting stories? Yes, 100% of you guys got to deliver something before delivering everything. Keep in mind, it's not just to split, not just to fit stuff into a sprint. If we focus on trying to fit stuff into a sprint, we won't think of a full slice. We'll probably start thinking in layers. So we want it to be, because we want to deliver something, get value to the user before we deliver everything we could possibly deliver. Okay, next question. What is one way to split a story that needs to create multiple items? Create a generic way to create any number of items, do an initial story that only allows a single item, or wait until the end of the project to do this part. Which is one way to split a story that needs to create multiple items? And yes, do an initial story that only allows a single item. So the problem with creating a generic way to create any number of items is that's going to defer getting feedback, because we're going to probably build something that's a lot bigger that will handle any number of things. If we split the story to do the smallest thing that lets us get feedback, I would suggest not only do you get feedback sooner, not only do we possibly make the user realize that what they're asking for isn't exactly what they want, but also if we then go to say, okay, we did this to one, now let's do a generic way to create any number of items, we now have a much bigger base of experience. Lots of stuff is going to be in place that wasn't there before, and we're going to be in a better place to understand the actual problem domain and also what the user is actually asking for. Because if we go through and prove that we can do what the user wants to with a single item, we probably are in a good case to figure out how they would want to do it with many items. If we don't do that, it's very likely we'll create a generic way to create any number of items, only to discover that the user left out some very important part of this that we didn't get communicated well. And so by doing a single item that we can do sooner, we're going to lower our risk and increase our ability to deliver on time and under budget. Okay, top spots there. Next question. If a story requires processing a file, you might try processing the complete file, starting by validating the header, create a generic file processing framework, or create file data integrity by monitoring the development. That last one, I don't even know what it is. I think I just threw a bunch of random words on there. So yeah, start by validating the header is the one that I was thinking of. If we start by trying to process the complete file, we will delay the amount of time that we get to the user. And here's one example of why this is going to be so important. If we're in a situation and we need to validate files and we tell the user, okay, we're going to work on the file validation, we're going to go away for a month and do all these complex file validating rules and get it all built, and then we'll come and show it to you. At the end of that month, we are likely going to ask the user for some sample files to go ahead and run through this so they can demonstrate it. If we discover they don't work, there's lots of problems. And it may take them a few months. I've been in situations where it took them a few months to actually come up with these sample files. However, if we start by validating the header, we'll then hopefully just within a day or two start saying, okay, can you give us some sample files? And it starts that process sooner rather than waiting until everything gets done. So starting to do these things sooner so you're actually getting the user more engaged and giving you feedback and interacting with you can be very, very valuable in moving your project forward and hitting all the problems before they're really big issues. You know, you're having that really rapid flow and rapid back and forth with the user of what you need. We're building this, can you test it? We're building this, can you give us something to run through it? And having those conversations early on. A generic file processing framework, once again, you would want to evolve to that, because what we know when we're first starting even as confident as we may be, there probably are lots of pieces that we would understand better if we start with just the smallest piece. Kate's in the top spot, followed by Christopher, Karen, Randy, and David. Next question. Larger stories create what? Happier customers, waste and waiting, faster feedback, or more return on investment? So dealing with larger stories instead of split up smaller stories, a number of split smaller stories. Yes, it creates waste and waiting. Larger stories are going to create longer feedback because remember, the larger stories take longer in time, even if they're delivering more value. The larger stories, you might say they have more return on investment, but like we showed earlier, if we're able to deliver smaller pieces that sum up to a larger story, we'll actually get a greater return on investment because we can start earning back some of our investment on the first part of the story before we get to the end of it, whereas otherwise we'd have all that waiting on all the stories. Okay, we got Kate, Christopher, Karen, Lopo, and David. Smaller stories do not let you what? They don't let you get feedback sooner. They don't let you reorder stories. They do not let you minimize customer contact, or they do not leave out parts that are lower value. And this one was tricky. So it's actually minimized customer contact. So that all of these are benefits of smaller stories other than minimizing customer contact. That was trickily worded. Hopefully it added a little bit of randomness to it and not just the person with the fastest internet connection wins. But what we want to do with smaller stories, you're going to have a lot more back and forth with the customer. So you're going to have things for them to use or try out sooner. So you'll maximize customer contact with smaller stories. Smaller stories also do let you leave out parts that are lower value. So in this case, this wouldn't be one of the selections because if we're able to do smaller stories, we can then choose, because usually if the customer is asking for something, there's parts of it that they absolutely need. But oftentimes there's parts of it that they may be willing to leave out if you give them the higher value stuff, like the internet site that we were talking about. Okay, Kate takes the top spot there, so congratulations, Kate. Go ahead and send me, you can take a screenshot of this or just email me, I'll be able to see it's you. And let me know what size sweatshirt you want and where you want it sent, and we will get it headed your way. I think, matter of fact, you probably got my email address, but let me just type it in here. So thank you all for coming. I will stick around for a little while. In the past, this has been an interesting topic that people wanted to chat about. And just to let you know, if you're working with a team that this is something that you're really wanting to improve, feel free to reach out to me. This is the type of coaching that I do with teams. One of the things that I do that's probably a little bit different is I'm not usually coming in just coaching from the standpoint of here's how you write your stories, but I'm usually trying to work with the developers to actually deliver the stories too, which kind of gets things from both ends. So you have on one end, the developers actually getting experience with how they do it on the development side, as well as when you're creating the stories. So if that sounds like something that would be helpful at your organization, please reach out. I would love to talk to you about setting up and working with your team. Like I said, I personally experienced places that this was huge in the amount of efficiency it brought. So if you've got a team that's looking at doing stuff, it probably would, if you're able to do this, the amount of investment you could make and still come out ahead is probably very, very significant, because you can definitely go from teams that are doing things with 50 down to teams accomplishing the same thing with 5. And particularly in large organizations. Small organizations that are really lean already, maybe it wouldn't be quite as dramatic, but it might be as dramatic, and it might even matter more to a small startup. So I'm going to stick around. If anybody has any questions, I'd love to chat.